Hello again. So now we're up to our last chapter. So we're up to chapter 27. So we're going to talk about the Cold War world. So nations post the Second World War had to restore government authority and legal systems because those were basically trampled after the war completely. So we're talking about like countries like Germany, Italy, and other ones as well. And of course, the Soviet Union too. So the US and the Soviet Union basically became superpowers after the Second World War. So what ends up happening is there's going to be what's called a Cold War that's going to start between them. And it's basically going to divide Europe. This war is not like actual fighting. It's not like there's going to be, another, battles that are going to start between, the United States and the Soviet Union, that they're going to be fighting on European soil and that sort of thing. It's going to be almost like a quasi war that's going to occur. And it's basically has to deal with, communist movement, socialist movements, and then eventually, like I mentioned, acquirements of, atomic weapons, bombs, and the like missiles. Okay. So in terms of it dividing Europe, we're going to have this thing known as the Iron Curtain. So the Soviet Union after World War II ended up controlling most of Eastern Europe. The defeated Germany was actually split into two. So we're going to have East Germany and West Germany. There's a thing that's going to be enacted known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was an economic plan, and it was a $13 billion plan over the period of 4 years for redevelopment post-war. So that was supposed to assist, with redevelopment. Truman, who was the president at the time for the United States, instituted the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine was basically a pledge to support the resistance of free peoples against communism. So they basically felt, specifically Truman and the United States, the Americans felt that it would be a domino effect, which we hear about. So that as the Soviet Union starts to expand, these Eastern Bloc countries are also going to fall into the fold of having communism. And then communism could basically spread throughout Europe, maybe into Asia and elsewhere. And they didn't want that to happen. So the Truman Doctrine was there to protect these countries from falling, quote unquote, victim to communist regimes, similar to what was happening in the Soviet Union. In 1949, Canada, the United States, and other representatives formed NATO, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So they formed that very similarly to the aftermath of the League of Nations that was founded by Woodrow Wilson. The Soviet Union feared this because they were like, hey, all these countries are uniting together. Who's not to say that they're going to have this alliance, that they're going to stand against, communism, which was the case. So both the United States and the Soviet Union basically rushed for nuclear power. They wanted to both find the hydrogen super bomb so that way they could have it and have it there for their, protection. Heaven forbid another battle should occur. The leader of Russia after the time of Stalin is Nikita Khrushchev. So Stalin's going to die in 1953. Nikita Khrushchev is going to take over in 1956. Khrushchev is not like a Stalin. He's not like a Lenin. He's a totally different communist leader. It's kind of different, kind of unique. In 1959, he's actually going to visit the United States. There's an image actually in your textbook where he's visiting, farmlands and workers. He actually made a trip to Disneyland. So he's not your typical type of Russian leader. He's kind of like on trend, I guess you can say. And he basically created the thaw. So what I mean by the thaw is like the thaw period of the Cold War. There was more open relations, I guess you can say, between the United States and the Soviet Union. There wasn't as much hostility or animosity between the two of them. Khrushchev was also responsible for de-Stalinization. So in terms of de-Stalinization, he's going to be responsible for emptying the gulags, releasing the Soviet prisoners that were at the period of Stalin. Because as I mentioned, Stalin was a bit of an aggressor. He caused a lot of problems within Russia himself, like with basically kicking out his political prisoners, sending them to gulags and these prisoner labor camps. So Khrushchev's main goal was basically to fix everything that Stalin did, de-Stalinize everything, and bring it back to, its prime, like basically at the time of Lenin or something better than that. Eastern Europe after the period of the Second World War was dealing with the repression. So Germany was already burdened with reparation payments because we know that they had owed billions of dollars in reparations for the war since they started it. They were also upset with the fact that a wall was built between East and West Germany, and it was not dismantled until 1989. So there's a long period of time where this wall is going to occur between the East and the West. And there's going to be slow economic development post-war in Europe. So like I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of rebuilding that's going to be needed. And of course, we have the play of communism, with the expansion of the Soviet Union into the Eastern Bloc regions as well. There's going to be other conflicts that are going to occur that we're going to talk about. So in China, there's going to be a Chinese revolution that's going to occur, after World War II. So civil war is going to rage in China basically since 1926. So it basically lasted quite a bit of time. Mao Zedong is going to be one of the leaders that's going to be responsible for this revolution. It basically was a peasant revolution in China. Mao basically accepted Marxism. So Karl Marx, which we talked about before, where he felt that everybody should be even and equal. It should be an even playing field. People should have the same opportunities for, farming land and the like. He basically believed that China should institute that. And that will happen. Like I mentioned, China will turn into like a communist nation with Marxist ideas. So that will happen, after this revolution is fought. We also have the Korean War. So Korea was basically a former Japanese colony, and it was divided after World War II. So there was communist North Korea, and then you had South Korea. In 1950, North Korea ended up attacking South Korea. And the United States was involved in the Korean War because they wanted to help defend South Korea. Because if you remember, we're talking about the Truman Doctrine. You're trying to protect a nation from being taken over by another communist nation. So if North Korea is communist and they're attacking South Korea, you want to make sure that they're there to protect it. So the United States, because of the Truman Doctrine, was involved and defended South Korea. And then 2 years later, the war was ended inconclusively, and they still have the same lines of border between both nations still to this day. And still, North Korea is still communist, and then you have South Korea being, semi-democratic down to the south. In Asia, there's going to be other things that are going to happening. So the British Empire is going to start to slowly unravel in Asia. So Great Britain started to lose its colonies there, because this is part of the idea of nationalistic nation building, those types of things that these Asian nations are starting to feel. So their colonies in Asia, specifically in India, in Palestine, and later on in Africa, are going to start to gain their independence from Britain. So we're going to kind of see that happening. A lot of these colonies are going to want independence. So it's going to be kind of like a domino effect where slowly, one after another, slowly going to try to get their own freedom from it. And then, of course, later on, French decolonization is going to occur in Indochina and eventually in Nigeria and elsewhere too. In Asia as well, between the period of 1946 to 1954, we have the First Vietnam War. Ho Chi Minh was one of the leaders. He campaigned for Vietnamese independence from France. And it was very difficult, vouch for independence. In 1945, both the United States and Great Britain had to get involved because of it. So there's a lot of issues with that, with the Vietnam War and getting involved in that and having a strong effect on Asia at that point in time. The book also talks about post-war culture and thought. I'll talk about writings, Black voices. They also place emphasis on Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. So we do see that in the chapter as well. And then the chapter ends with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the last parts of the Cold War. But mind you, the Cold War, even though we're talking about the period of, the 40s, 50s, 60s, is going to extend out until the 80s. So the 1980s is when the Cold War is going to slowly start to thaw out as time goes on. And that's going to lead eventually up to the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. Okay, so the Cuban Missile Crisis started in 1962 in Cuba. So Fidel Castro came to power as a communist leader in 1958. The U.S. basically invaded via the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The issue is that Castro, as a leader, he allowed the Soviet Union to base their nuclear missiles in Cuba. So, of course, the United States is going to be fearful of that since they're two communist nations. Cuba is a small island nation in the Caribbean, very close proximity to the United States, so they're going to be very, very fearful of that. And they're allowing the Soviets, who already rushed to have missiles and atomic weapons and the like, to basically plant them in Cuba, possibly even pointing them toward the United States. So now that's going to come about with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in 1962, our U.S. president was President John Kennedy. He basically confronted Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet leader at the point in time. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade to block from Cuba to the United States to prevent it from happening. It's also going to cause, sanctions and other things against the nation too. That's going to affect it economically. Eventually, after 3 weeks, the Soviets basically withdrew their missiles on Cuban soil, and the conflict actually ended. But it did not end, like I said, the Cold War or the animosity between the Soviet Union and the United States. That's going to be long lasting, like I mentioned, up until the 1980s. It's going to be lasting for quite a bit of time. If you study further onward into Western Civ 2 or even U.S. history 2, they talk about, being, careful about, nuclear weapons being dropped on the United States. They had like bomb threats and those types of things. Use of spies. There could be spies on American soil that could be coming from the U.S., the USSR, from the Soviet Union, moving onto our territory to try to, steal our secrets, or vice versa. So there's going to be, like I mentioned, the Cold War, despite the fact that it's not going to be, actually fought militarily, it's still going to have an effect, not in an economic state of mind, but it's also going to have effect just on the day-to-day lives of Americans and of course, your Europeans as well. It's going to have a strong effect on them. So that basically ends our Cold War discussion. So as you read through, kind of take a peek at, what ended up happening for these various countries after the World War. So after Germany, ended up faltering, what ended up happening with that, leading up to the Soviet Union is what you're going to basically be focusing on. Pay attention to the maps, pay attention to the different things within the textbook as well. All right, thank you so much.